If it's Friday, former President Trump once again lashing out at the special counsel office as he faces new criminal charges tied to his mishandling of the classified documents, including new allegations he tried to erase potentially incriminating security camera footage. Plus, security concerns for the next potential batch of Trump indictments. Barricades are being installed around the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta, where charging decisions in that case are expected soon. And security officials prepare for more charges in Washington, perhaps at the end of next week. And as major legal developments swirl around the former president, the current president tries to avoid the Trump vortex as Joe Biden hits the road to tout his economic agenda and maybe pick off an electoral vote in New England in the process. Happy Friday. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd reporting from New York, and we're going to begin with the fallout from those new federal charges against former President and current Republican frontrunner Donald Trump in the classified documents case, as well as new evidence, a new defendant, and a new witness, which comes as we await a whole new set of indictments tied to the efforts to overturn the 2020 election. So, to get us back to the classified document situation, in a 60-page superseding indictment unsealed late yesterday in the classified documents case, the special counsel Jack Smith accused Mr. Trump of obstruction of justice when he allegedly tried to get his staff to erase Mar-a-Lago security footage that had been subpoenaed by the FBI. They have also charged him with an additional count of possessing classified documents, essentially confirming the report that the former president did, in fact, share a classified document about war plans with Iran with guests at his New Jersey golf club. If you recall, that conversation about the document was recorded on tape, and we've all heard it at this point. All told, the former president now faces 3 additional criminal counts, 1 for the document he shared with guests and 2 for his alleged attempts to erase that security camera footage sought by investigators. Mr. Trump has lashed out at the new charges today on social media. Not surprising, of course. He's calling them textbook third world intimidation, once again trying to make it all about politics. He's called on special counsel Jack Smith and the Attorney General Merrick Garland to be thrown in jail while defending his actions this morning on a nationally syndicated radio show.
But these people, these are thugs. Jack Smith is, I call him deranged Jack Smith. He's a prosecutor who's been overturned unanimously in the Supreme Court. Vicious tactics. They went after 2 fine employees yesterday, fine people. And I don't think they think that the tapes were even changed. These were my tapes that we gave to them. And they basically then say that's not enough. I don't think we would have had to give it. I'm not sure that we would have even had to give it. These were security tapes. We handed them over to them. I doubt we would have, if we wanted to fight that, I doubt we would have had to give it. But regardless, we gave it.
So the employees he's referencing there are both employees at Mar-a-Lago. One is his valet, Walt Nauta, who was previously charged as a co-conspirator in the case, and he now faces 2 additional charges. The other is Carlos de Oliveira, a maintenance supervisor at Mar-a-Lago, who becomes the 3rd defendant in this case. He's been charged in connection to that scheme to delete surveillance video as well as lying to investigators. His attorney has declined to comment. All of this comes a day after sources told NBC News that the special counsel's office has already informed Mr. Trump's attorneys to expect another entirely new indictment in connection with efforts to overturn the 2020 election. All right, so we're going to unpack all this. Joining me now, we got outside of the president's New Jersey home in Bedminster is Vaughn Hilliard. And with me here on set is our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, and Danny Savalos, a criminal defense attorney who's an NBC News legal analyst. Vaughn Hilliard, let me start with you. It was a very tired Donald Trump we heard, which may mean he is certainly, I want to overread into things, but you can kind of tell when he has been absorbing things. And I guess my first question to you is, were they expecting this superseding indictment, or did this blindside them?
There's no indication that they were expecting anything to come out of Florida here from the special counsel's office. The attention was wholly on the January 6th investigation out of Washington, D.C. Two of his attorneys met with the special counsel's office yesterday in Washington, D.C. That is where the full attention was here. And now the superseding indictment, it has implications potentially. We could expect that the defense team is going to want to push this trial back from May of next year to beyond the 2024 election. But you can hear in Donald Trump's voice, this is a man who for years has been able to, tangle a web of lies, a web of explanations that are often obfuscate the truth, and yet there's never been really true consequences. But this time, Donald Trump, in just the last several months, in his own words, has given explanations about what unfolded in these classified documents investigation, and yet he has only muddied the waters and made the future arguments from his legal defense counsel even tougher. And when you look at here now the fact that you have Tavares, the IT worker, who is clearly to some extent a key witness in this here for the prosecution, Donald Trump's own timeline is difficult because his lawyers said on June 3rd that they had turned over all relevant documents. And now in the superseding indictment, prosecutors are suggesting that there were conversations that existed between him, a maintenance worker, and Walt Nauta to delete footage that may have shown that, in fact, that they knew that more classified material was not only present, but had been moved.
So what do we know? We've been able to identify. It appears there's somebody cooperating with the special counsel that is an employee, referred to Trump employee 4 in the superseding indictment. You referred to him as an IT guy. He appears to be the cooperating witness here?
It seems like the amount of evidence and the specificity in which the prosecutors are describing direct quotes, including the quote from De Oliveira that the boss wanted the server to be deleted, would suggest that either Tavares gave very detailed notes or somehow, some way, the prosecutors were able to have a recording in which they were able to transcribe such a specific quote here. We do know that Walt Nauta and De Oliveira are currently being, to the best of our knowledge, represented by lawyers who in the past have been paid by Trump's leadership PAC, Save America. And so for all intents and purposes, we believe right now these co-conspirators, co-defendants are still very much lawyered to Donald Trump, and at least the story and the defense that the former president and his team would be eager to mount.
How much of their fundraising right now is geared toward the campaign, and how much of their fundraising is geared toward paying for legal defense? Or is it just all in the same pile of money here?
There's a lot of Americans that are on these email lists, and if you go and click on one of those Trump fundraising emails and you go and make a donation, 90% of your donation, it goes to the Trump 2024 campaign. But then there's that 10% that goes to the Save America Leadership PAC. And that PAC not only is used to advance his political purposes, but there are tens of thousands of dollars, according to financial records from 2022, that show the litany of lawyers not only representing Donald Trump, but his other allies that have had their own legal peril, that those have been going on. Monday is going to be a telling day because we'll actually get the financial records from 2023, and we'll be able to see the extent to which those lawyers representing some of these defendants have been paid here than this year.
Vaughn Hilliard with some of the political impact of this at Bedminster on the Trump beat for us. Vaughn, thank you. Let me bring in the legal team here, Laura Jarrett, Danny Savala. So, Laura, explain to me why there has been, why this, the coverage of this new superseding indictment has been, these are really damning new charges. For some people, they're going to be like, oh, this is count 72, 73, 74. What makes this? Why are some people saying, whoa, this is a big deal?
I think that the superseding indictment blows out of the water one of the primary defense that we've heard from the former president, which is, I had the complete authority to take these documents. It was my right to take these documents. If you truly believe that you had the authority to take them, then why are you attempting to delete the security footage that shows you moving them around? And that prosecutors were going to use that to try to tell a story to the jury about a consciousness of guilt, about the idea that he knew this was wrong, and this is part of the cover-up story.
So why do we think, is it as obvious as it looks that Jack Smith just got another cooperating witness, was able to get enough evidence to put this in an indictment since the last one. Is that basically what it's what it looks like? Is that what we should?
It's certainly one of the things we're trying to report out right now is what in the world is going on with Yusel Taveras. We have confirmed that that's employee 4. We have confirmed that once upon a time he was represented by Stan Woodward, who also represents other witnesses in this case.
So suddenly he is no longer like Cassidy Hutchinson. We saw this.
Exactly.
When she changed attorneys, right? The minute we see an attorney change, you're suddenly gone, oh.
It's at least something to raise questions about. And something we're trying to pin down is exactly who is this man's lawyer, because it appears his status is a little bit different now.
So, Danny, it sounds like Trump's defense is going to be, but I didn't alter the security footage.
His defense is basically going to remain the same, and it's limited. It's always been limited. It was limited 2 months ago when the original indictment came out. It's really going to be limited to some variation of, I don't know anything, or these are my minions and they did things I have no control over. That's really about it. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that that's the optimal defense. I don't mean that that's an ideal situation. Defense attorneys take the facts as they're given to them, and we have to come up with something based on those facts. Prosecutors pick the facts. We have to come up with a defense that, as long as the judge lets us get it in, we got to try it.
Well, let me ask you this. So here, the boss exchange, right, which is, Trump. So here's apparently, according to this superseding indictment, De Oliveira told Trump employee 4, we believe this is the IT guy, that the boss, referring to Donald Trump, wanted the server deleted. Trump employee 4 responded that he would not know how to do that and that he did not believe that he would have the right to do that. Trump employee 4 told De Oliveira that De Oliveira would have to reach out to another employee who was a supervisor of security for Trump's business organization. De Oliveira then insisted to Trump employee 4 that the boss wanted the server deleted and asked, what are we going to do? Is that enough to basically tie it to Trump? I mean, how do you prove that? It's pretty circumstantial, is it not?
Now, there's a lot going on there. When you think about these two co-defendants, De Oliveira and Nauta, this is
but the employee 4 is not the co-defendant here.
Exactly right. And employee 4, you can reasonably infer that everybody who's named anonymously, those are people that provided information. Right. And we can expect they will march in at trial and give testimony. And the other thing to consider, too, is that narrative you just described. For Trump to have a defense, if it's not true that the boss gave these orders, that means he has to turn on Nauta. It means he has to turn on De Oliveira. So while we say today, those folks may be saying to their lawyers, I am standing firm with the boss. I love him. He's my guy.
Trump could throw him under the water.
Trump's defense almost necessarily will be, these guys are liars. They did this of their own accord. Again, he's got limited options. This appears to be what is remaining in a closing window.
There is not a chance that that exchange is all that Jack Smith has, and then he indicted the former president of the United States. You can't have some hearsay.
You think this is the minimal he had to put into the indictment?
Exactly.
But not the maximum.
I would be shocked if that's all he has, because it's hearsay.
Because this wouldn't be enough, would it?
No.
On its own.
I think that on its own, I think that's a hard case to make. I think he must have something else to bolster it, and he doesn't have to show his cards right now.
Let's talk about scheduling this trial. So now there's a superseding indictment.
I've been beating this drum for months.
Because I assume this now makes it easier to delay this thing.
Of course. I said at the day the indictment came out, look, I have to take the government to task on one thing. They originally wanted this case to go to trial December 11th. I said, not a chance. Then the judge set May 24th, and I said, not a chance. If you asked me for my reasons, I couldn't give them to you, but I know that things happen, unexpected things. Chuck, we're 2 months out from the original indictment. It took a month for one of the co-defendants to get arraigned. Now, 2 months out, we already have a superseding indictment with a new defendant and new allegations, new counts, all kinds of new things, something nobody foresaw. Right. Yesterday, we were all sitting around waiting for an indictment hundreds of miles away in D.C., so none of us anticipated this. This is a reason to push it out. The government will argue they can still go to trial in May. The defense has a very fair argument to push it out. And so here's why I take them to task very briefly, is that the government, in arguing for a December date, must have known on some level, they had some thread and some possibility that there might be a superseding indictment. They were the only people who knew that. So for them to argue for a December trial date seems a little strange now. But I get it. They want to rush to trial. The defense doesn't.
What if they're okay with it slipping? What if they're okay with it slipping because they want to bolster the case and they'd rather do it the right way? And if they're going to charge him in another jurisdiction that might move a little faster, what does it matter if the date slips?
This is where it can get complicated. in the purest form, if I were at Justice, I would not want the presidential campaign to be hovering over the trial.
Yeah.
I'd want it after. Now, if he wins, everything changes.
If he wins, the whole case goes away. If he wins, he fires the attorney general. He gets to pick his own attorney general. He fires Jack Smith to the extent Jack Smith isn't around.
Is there going to be a single
doesn't have to go
trial, New York, Atlanta, Washington, or Florida, that will happen before November of 2024?
New York might.
How would that take?
New
how would
York
that
might.
happen?
The discovery is a little bit more limited. It's not about classified documents, about hush money payments and falsifying distance records. Doesn't mean he's not going to try to delay it, but I think that of all the cases, that's ironically the one that might actually happen before the election.
So the case that sort of
on the periphery, not about undoing democracy. Yes.
Right, and the other three, obviously much more serious. Do we assume, Danny, that Fani Willis and Jack Smith are coordinating?
Coordinating
to a point.
But I often wonder if there might even be a subtle bit of competition here. They're very conscious of who's going to indict who for what first.
What competition? The feds always win.
They always win. By the way, that's something that people aren't talking about enough, which is that your odds are always a lot better in state court. I don't care if it's Fulton County. I've never had a case in Fulton County, but I can just tell you the odds are always better in state court, especially in a big county, high population county. Those are usually the easier places to win. You virtually, and I'm saying this as somebody who's in federal court, I don't prefer to be in federal court. Federal court's a depressing place to be for a criminal defendant because they virtually almost always lose.
Is it surprising to them not to get a heads up on a superseding indictment or not?
Defense attorneys?
Yeah.
No, but it does speak to sort of what I think will probably be strained relations from here on out.
Because they dropped this. They clearly met on the other case. Yeah. And we have every indication.
They could have given a professional heads up. But how many times have you had a prosecutor?
We do have something coming today.
So many times.
It's not with this case, just FYI.
Exactly. That would be a professional courtesy that you can imagine that's extended. And it's sort of the reason why you want a good criminal defense attorney who has a relationship as a former federal prosecutor have that kind of conversation. We don't have any evidence that happened.
There's a new lawyer every week that he brings onto the team that needs time to ramp up, which I assume is another way for them to continue to try to buy time.
Yes, and this is a client that will eventually lead to strained relations because this is a client that gives orders. Go tell them that I said this, that, or the other. And that necessarily, even if these attorneys, and some of them are really experienced federal criminal defense attorneys, really, really accomplished folks, but that gives them their marching orders. That makes it very tough to have a good relationship with the government. And by the way, the government can be tough to deal with. Sometimes they're reasonable, sometimes not.
One of his former lawyers, in this case it was Ty Cobb, who was part of one of the early impeachments when he was president. Or the Mueller. He was during the Mueller apologies there. He describes the classified document case as beyond open and shut. As a defense attorney, would you be telling your client that?
I don't know which open and shut he said, but I would be. The classified documents case is going to be a really difficult case to win. This latest superseding indictment
for Trump.
For Trump. Yeah. Yes, of course, the government has the burden, but the government almost always meets that burden. Keep in mind, the reason they're so good is that they've investigated this case for a long, long time, and they didn't indict unless and until, going back to what Laura said, they did not tell us everything they have in this indictment. They don't have to. They don't want to. They're not going to show all their cards. And you have to believe that if they are going to take on the most difficult criminal defendant in American criminal history, that they are going to have everything lined up. They're going to be loaded for bear.
I'm curious, how do we think Justice received the Trump attorney's threats or warnings that a January 6th indictment, Laura, could tear this country apart? It's almost like, I hate to say, it almost feels like an old mob boss saying, it's a mighty fine democracy you have there.
I think that you say that
because, like to keep it.
I think that you say that given who the client is and his past history of inflammatory remarks. But I think, objectively, that's not actually a crazy thing to say. If your argument is institutionally, this could have ramifications, and maybe it's up to the voters to decide whether he's fit for office. I can understand that argument in theory, given though who the client is and what he has said and what he has arguably inspired. Obviously, different story.
Have you ever seen a federal prosecutor go, well, we should bring charges, but maybe we ought to hold off?
No, but I have had a client in a situation where they reduced the charges to lesser offenses. So there are times where you might see something get reduced. Does it go away completely because you go in and make your case? No.
If Donald Trump cooperated at all, they would have.
This case would not exist.
They would love to cut a deal if he would admit something, right?
This would be a plea deal.
If he would admit something, they'd cut a deal tomorrow.
Yes, and this is somebody who would never, ever enter into a plea agreement. So they know from the beginning this case is always going to go to trial. Sometimes you have a client that will never even look at a plea agreement, and that's the way it is.
Well, I think he believes the only way he wins this case is at the ballot box in November. And it certainly looks like.
And that would be a win in the federal
cases. It certainly looks like that seems to be the only strategy legally that they have. Thanks, guys.
Sure.
What a week. Enjoy the vacation. Good luck getting it. Coming up, new reporting on how security officials in both Washington and Atlanta are preparing for more potential Trump charges that could come any day now. Plus, more charges, more problems, how Republicans are reacting and defending Mr. Trump despite his mounting legal issues. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. A special counsel, Jack Smith, announces additional charges in the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. There are security preparations underway in both Georgia and Washington, D.C. ahead of what is likely to be more potential indictments against the former president involving his efforts to overturn the election, both January 6th in Washington and, of course, the infamous Georgia phone call. As you can see, orange security barriers were spotted going up around the Fulton County Courthouse, where Trump may be facing charges for his alleged role in trying to overturn the Georgia 2020 election. That was, as I talked, that phone call when he asked Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find him 11,000 votes. District Attorney Fani Willis has said she will be announcing charging decisions sometime this summer. Meanwhile, in D.C., U.S. Secret Service and Metro PD were meeting yesterday as they begin to coordinate for another potential arraignment of the former president. Joining me now is our Justice and Intelligence correspondent, Ken Delaney. So, Ken, we've seen similar things in Miami. We saw similar things here. I'm in New York, in Manhattan. I think you were there that day as well. We actually haven't seen a lot of problems at those arraignments. How does that impact the planning in Atlanta and D.C.?
No, that's the good news, Chuck, but they're still going to plan for it because they have to be cautious, and there is an environment and an atmosphere of very violent rhetoric, particularly after the last indictment. There was a lot of it. There were lawmakers calling this indictment an act of war, and there was all kinds of rhetoric swirling around. And the concern is it only takes a couple of disturbed people. The good news, though, is you're right. We haven't seen the kind of January 6th style violent demonstrations turning into riots around these various law enforcement activities related to the former president. And what I'm told by both private researchers and law enforcement officials, we haven't seen really an uptick of threats leading up to this expected indictment relating to the election of former President Donald Trump, in part because it's been a slow boil. I mean, it's been coming for a while. They know it's coming. It's not going to come as a shock. But nonetheless, after that classified documents indictment, there was a lot of violent rhetoric coursing around, and I think we can expect that again. And so, therefore, we can expect the security agencies to really beef up the profile and be ready for anything.
Speaking of security, what kind of security are prosecutors getting?
Well, that's interesting. You know, both special counsel Jack Smith and special counsel Robert Hur, who probably a lot of people wouldn't know if they ran into in the grocery store, have full security details. They walk around with bodyguards. And I don't think that was always the case with special counsels going back into history. I'm not even sure that Robert Mueller had one, because I remember there was a time where one of our reporters walked up to him at church to ask him a question. I don't remember any security detail being there. At least he didn't have a full-time one. So there's definitely a concern about security and such that bodyguards are protecting the special counsels 24/7.
Mm-hmm. All the attention justice has been getting, all of the rhetoric. What's morale like with rank-and-file prosecutors these days?
You know, it's a mixed picture, right? Nobody, particularly, it's more an issue with the FBI. The FBI is under assault daily in Congress, particularly by Republicans, and the FBI is a Republican organization. You know, DOJ less so, and this is a Democratic administration, so all the political appointees are Democrats. They have their heads down. They're doing their work. They're very, over here, they're doing, for example, like the patterns and practice lawsuit that was filed against or investigation announced against Memphis PD, that kind of thing. They feel like they can really change policy. So they're not so concerned about the rhetoric. On the FBI side, though, there is a bit of a morale issue. They're feeling a little bit ground down by particularly this onslaught from Republican members of Congress, Chuck.
No, and you can see it in the director of the FBI. He almost acts as if he's been ground down. You know, he's so, and he's retreating almost the way a turtle's retreating into the shell.
Yeah, indeed.
Mr. Ray, come out and speak. Ken Delanian at the Justice Department for us. Ken, thank you. Up next, trouble on the trail. Ron DeSantis has had to cut staff. He's slumping in the polls, and he's now facing backlash from his Republican rivals over Florida's new controversial school standards when it comes to teaching slavery. I'll talk to a Trump ally turned DeSantis supporter about the state of the race next. But first, it's today's Meet the Press Minute. As today's Republican Party rallies around their leader, despite criminal allegations. We're going to take a look back to 1974 when Republican leaders turned on Republican President Richard Nixon amid the Watergate criminal scandal. Here's then Republican Congressman John Anderson weighing in on the GOP's strategy ahead of the 1974 midterms.
Congressman Anderson, Senator Weicker of Connecticut last night urged Republican candidates in his state to run as far away from President Nixon as they can get. You think that's going to be the general tendency of Republican congressional candidates this year?
It would be disingenuous of me not to admit that the president is a liability in many areas of the country today. I think he himself has conceded that. A majority of candidates will concentrate on conducting independent campaigns. If they're incumbents, based on their own record. If challengers, I think they would emphasize their ability to be quite independent of the White House.
Welcome back. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' campaign, reset bus tour, if you want to call it, rolled on in Iowa today, appearing technically as a guest of the super PAC Never Back Down. DeSantis met with voters in Albia and Oskaloosa, Iowa, perhaps as part of the campaign's new goal of getting more intimate audiences for its candidate. He wants to do the full 99 counties, the full Grassley. Talking to the press today, DeSantis was on the defensive for remarks he gave earlier this week defending Florida curriculum that would require students to be taught about some benefits that slaves got from slavery. South Carolina Senator and our rival Republican presidential candidate Tim Scott rebuked DeSantis for it. And DeSantis responded, dismissing the criticism as a false narrative that he said is being perpetuated by the left. Former Vice President Mike Pence, meanwhile, is knocking DeSantis for a suggestion that anti-vaccine activist and Democrat Robert F. Kennedy Jr. could be his pick to lead the CDC or even FDA. Well, today, DeSantis said he agreed with Kennedy's criticisms of Dr. Anthony Fauci. DeSantis' comments come as some notable voices inside the GOP are urging him to refocus the campaign away from culture war issues and focus more on the message that won him a landslide re-election victory in Florida last year. To quote the Wall Street Journal editorial board today, they write, Mr. DeSantis turned a narrow first gubernatorial win into a blowout re-election in a competitive state. A record that compelling would be a terrible thing to waste on a campaign based on right-wing grievances. Well, joining me now, Ken Cuccinelli. He is the founder of the Never Back Down PAC that is supporting Governor DeSantis. He's played a key role in Ted Cruz's 2016 campaign, so it's not his first rodeo against the Donald Trump juggernaut these days. Mr. Cuccinelli, happy Friday to you, sir.
Good to be with you.
Let me start. I'd like to get you to respond to the Wall Street Journal editorial page there. They have lamented the direction of the DeSantis messaging, the DeSantis campaign. Do you accept that critique that he's been mired too much in some of these culture war issues?
No, I don't. They have a place. They're not the whole race. But Ron DeSantis is the national leader in K through 12, protecting children against this agenda and the over-sexualization of children. He's the national leader in taking back public higher education in this space against the woke agenda, including getting men in particular out of women's locker rooms for sports. That's just one group of it. And he's leading the country from the state level against the ESG agenda, where you see the woke agenda show up in corporations. And so it's a pretty big contest. Now, in his comments today, he also noted he's knocked Florida's debt down by 25%, while Donald Trump added $8 trillion to the national debt. Got Florida, by the way, to the second lowest debt per capita while cutting taxes. So he isn't ignoring economic issues at all. But I don't accept at all that these aren't important. I'll tell you, Chuck, I've been out, not just in Iowa, but in a lot of states, stumping for the benefit of Governor DeSantis. And this is a firing up issue, and his reelection, he captured Democrat and independent mothers and suburban voters because of the great job he was doing protecting their children in schools and getting them back into school.
Well, you sort of are conflating, though. I mean, I think that's where I'm getting at. You know, I thought Rich Lowry put it very well earlier this week in Politico. He asked the question, what happened to the Florida DeSantis? And he notes here, and I'm going to just read a bit of an excerpt. DeSantis in Florida wasn't primarily a culture warrior, even if that was an important part of his agenda. His signature reelection ad, with Floridians from various walks of life thanking him for the job he did in his first term, warm and fuzzy, and only made a reference to one cultural issue very obliquely. The point being is he's really leaning in more on what, look, you did it just now. Look, he's leading on ESG. He's leading on this. This isn't what everyday voters are worried about. I take the primary voters in Iowa might be fired up about it, but is it sort of losing, are you the old forest through the trees here, right? Are you not seeing the bigger picture, or is the message not seeing the bigger picture?
I understand the concern. Chuck, I understand the concern. I don't think it's an illegitimate issue to discuss. But as you noted, he's in Iowa this week. He's talking to Iowans. They do care about it. It is not the only subject he's covering. It is a big part of media coverage. And I would point out that a lot of while DeSantis implemented many good economic policies, what made him stand out nationally in terms of Florida's performance was that he opened Florida back up when that was a very controversial thing to do. Donald Trump and the mainstream media and the so-called experts were all against him on that, and yet he did it. I mentioned the schools benefit to children, but that also allowed their small and medium-sized businesses in Florida to thrive, and it's why hundreds of thousands of people moved to Florida, was that freedom agenda that covered not just the cultural issues, but also economic issues. So I partially agree with you in the sense that you can't just talk about cultural issues. I don't agree with the Wall Street Journal that that is not important in some way. It is very important to mainstream conservative grassroots Republican voters.
Let me ask you this. What is the metric? You've got donors who love to be blind quote backseat drivers to your campaign, as you might know. What is the metric that they should watch? Yeah. What's the metric you would offer up right now to say, hey, the reset has worked? See, we are making progress. Because one of the things I'm wondering about is, what is an event coming up? Is it the debate? Where can the Governor DeSantis tell the doubters, hey, see, everything, we've righted the ship. We had a tough start, but we're in good shape. What's a metric that you would advise people to watch for to say, yeah, that's proof that it's working?
So obviously the debates are milestones in the campaign, and oftentimes they are make or break in both directions for various campaigns. And we can both, I'm sure, rattle off examples of both from previous races. I would note that that's going to be particularly interesting contrast without Donald Trump there. Donald Trump lost the first presidential debate to Joe Biden. He is a good showman, but he is not a good debater because it highlights his weaknesses. Whereas in Ron DeSantis's case, it showcases his preparation, his brain power, and his application of it all to the benefit of ordinary Americans' lives. So I look very forward to his performance in those debates as a place to expand his forward-looking vision for America. And a lot of what he did in Florida has national implications, and he keeps spelling those out. He talked about the military. He's the only veteran running this week. He started that Monday in South Carolina. He's continued to roll out policies that connect his vision, including the cultural positions he's taken, for instance, in the military and how debilitating it is for the military, to a national commander-in-chief position. And the more he does that, the more American voters are going to appreciate how it's going to affect their lives in their state outside of Florida. And I think that's going to make a lot of headway for him.
Are you at all concerned that as a super PAC, you guys are almost too engaged in winning the day-to-day social media news cycle? There's been this critique. The DeSantis campaign's too online. They respond too much to what fires people up online. Like RFK Jr. is sort of a creature of the internet. He doesn't really like the rest of the world doesn't really feel it or see it, right? It's really just the most passionate activists know what's going on with him. And it does feel like a little bit too online. Do you at all accept that critique?
No, I don't. I will tell you, as the founder of this super PAC, we intended from day one to be different among super PACs. We've knocked over 1 million doors. We crossed the millionth door in South Carolina on behalf of the governor this week. There is no other campaign or super PAC that I'm even aware of is knocking doors at any scale. We're talking to voters one at a time so they can get to know Governor DeSantis's personal history, in a way you don't get from a mailer or in these, the TV back and forths that is much more personal. I'm a believer that hearts and minds are changed by people, not the news stations and not media and so forth. So that's a great success for us that no one else is even challenging us on. So you can expect to see this super PAC continue to behave differently than super PACs ever have before.
If Trump's not in the first debate, this could be a big contrast between DeSantis and Tim Scott. Do you think that's a good thing for your candidacy, for his candidacy?
I think that I don't think it's relevant necessarily to specifically Tim Scott so much as that a lot of Republican voters or those who may vote in Republican nominations, independents, for instance, vote in New Hampshire, they'll tune in and they'll start to get a feel for him that they haven't gotten yet. Chuck, you and I are not statistically normal in the amount of attention we pay to a race this far off this early. And yet there's a whole narrative around, the polls say this or as if we're at the closing gate and we're really barely at the starting gate. And his perseverance and work ethic are going to play a big role in his good performance in the debate and his gradual building toward victory when we turn the corner on 2024.
Well, you better hope Yogi Berra isn't right in that it's getting late early. Anyway, Ken Cuccinelli from Never Back Down. Appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective with us. Good to talk with you. After the break, the field, the vortex, and the fallout. The GOP's 2024 frontrunner now faces 74 criminal charges, combined state and federal. We're going to dig deeper into the political fallout for the former president and his party next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. 3 new charges in yesterday's superseding indictment in the special counsel's classified documents case may have a legal impact on Trump's future, but when it comes to politics, they barely made a drop in the bucket, at least not yet. When asked about the new charges, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy returned to a common refrain we've heard from many Republicans about previous charges against Donald Trump. He told reporters the charges are proof of a politicized two-tier justice system targeting President Trump and not President Biden for the documents he had in his possession, despite the very obvious difference here that there isn't evidence Biden's team defied a subpoena, tried to erase security tapes, or obstructed government efforts to recover those documents. Here's McCarthy.
What concerns me is you have a sitting president that has a situation like this, but even worse, that had documents, but nothing's happened. You've had, and he's
how is it worse? Because they're alleging he's obstructing investigation. He's under investigation.
But he's not indicted. Why do they keep indicting presidents?
Who knows?
No, it's forever. It might be who knows. That's the point. Who knows? You're a Biden, so it's never going to happen. That's the difference, and that's the frustration.
All right, I'm joined today for our mini panel, former Department of Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson and Rich Lowry, editor of the National Review. Come to New York to get the brain power of you two. It's good to see you both. Jay, you worked for Rudy Giuliani in the Southern District of New York, so you're a prosecutor. I want to ask you on the legal side of things. I understand that. Yes. On the legal side of things, how serious is this additional charge legally for Donald Trump? We'll talk of the politics a minute, but legally.
In terms of his legal jeopardy, no more serious than the first indictment. It's additional counts, enables the government to offer additional evidence. Federal criminal practitioners, defense or prosecution, live by the federal sentencing guidelines. I looked up the federal sentencing guidelines for a conviction on obstruction of justice charges, which is what he's charged with. The baseline is what we refer to as level 14. If you're at a level 14 with no prior criminal history, that is 15 to 21 months in jail. That's just the obstruction
for this new charge. Yeah.
Just on the obstruction charge alone. What I fail to understand politically is how can a rational voter vote for a man who has a very realistic possibility of going to jail at some point. I mean,
well, the trials may not happen before the election.
Well, it may not happen before the election, but he's in real serious legal jeopardy.
So, Ron DeSantis, campaign struggling. Oh my God, the front runners got indicted again. There's 74 counts. Like, in theory, this should be the path back.
Yeah.
And it's not.
It's not. And this was the key inflection point. It's not necessarily anything DeSantis has done wrong. It was the Bragg indictment, which Trump was already leading in the polling averages, but then he's up another 10 points, and he's been at that higher level ever since.
Is Alvin Bragg going to be the MVP of Trump's nomination?
It's the best and most important thing that's happened so far in the Republican campaign. And the thing is, since Republicans have this defensive reaction around Trump, it doesn't matter how many times you indict him. In fact, the more you indict him, the more he can say, We're
going to have over 100 counts.
Yeah.
When all said and done, we're at 74 now, right? It's likely, and
there's really,
it starts to be numbing.
The Bragg one is weak. This, I don't think there's any legal defense. And Trump, the legal defense will be delaying it, and then it's the political defense that's most important. It's selective prosecution. So I'm either going to get elected president and make it go away, or another Republican's going to get elected president, and if it's anyone besides, Chris Christie, he'll probably get pardoned. Or failing all that, I'll find a juror or two who's a Republican or favorably inclined and just won't convict.
Supposedly, Trump's attorneys, one of the warnings they said to Jack Smith's team was, "Hey, you're going to rip the country apart."
Right.
How often does that impact a prosecutor?
It shouldn't, in my judgment. You know what we lawyers say. If you have the facts, pound the facts. If you have the law, urge the law. If you have neither, pound the table. And that's effectively what's going on here. They have nothing other than he's too big to prosecute, which doesn't work and really shouldn't work for prosecutors. I actually think in 1974, Gerald Ford did the right thing by pardoning Richard Nixon.
Are you sure that was the right thing now? We've been taught that it was.
For that
and I
moment,
wonder if in that moment.
But in hindsight,
in hindsight, though, had we allowed the system to work, and he's pardoned after he has his trial. He didn't pardon him before, and I always wondered if that was a mistake.
First, Chuck, let's do a level set here.
Yeah.
I think that what Donald Trump has done, both in his presidency and after, frankly, it was way more serious than Watergate.
Heard that line a million times on a certain
I think it was
channel.
right at the time. I think now that we are in an environment where the criminal justice system is being attacked, where there's all sorts of political skepticism about how our government functions, I don't think the Department of Justice has any choice but to pursue the case that they've already begun.
My prediction is that a second-term President Biden commutes the sentences of former President Donald Trump. You could just sort of see that. So the half forward.
Well, that's a
you don't get pardoned. How about that, right? It's more likely that you will never see an expungement, but you might see a commutation.
Commuter sentence.
Is there an event? Ron DeSantis, to me, has a problem, and I was trying to get at this with my Ken Cuccinelli interview, which is when you're doing a reset, you need a moment to prove it's working.
Yeah.
A debate without Donald Trump doesn't feel like a great moment.
Yeah, so he'll be the target in a debate without Donald Trump. And I think
a front runner without the polling.
Chris Christie, in particular, will be a major threat. He's going to go after DeSantis like Rubio in 16 if Trump isn't there. So
have you watched debate footage of Ron DeSantis? By the way, he's not good at this.
It hasn't been the best.
It has not been the best. I mean, if Christie gets a moment with him, that could be trouble.
Sometimes it can be the best thing that happens, that you're just forgotten, left for dead, and sometimes it's the path to recovery. I remember in 2004 being alone in a seat next to John Kerry, interviewing him in Iowa on not even a campaign bus, like a little shuttle, because there's no one else.
Why are they interviewing? Like, sure, that's what we do. Like,
the whole time I was like, I felt so sorry for him having to talk to me because there's no one else who would do it. And then, there was a flight to quality. There were no other good options. So, but then also sometimes being left for dead is a prelude to being dead.
Well, let me ask you this. Would you rather be DeSantis or Scott?
That's a really tough question. I think I'd still rather be DeSantis because... So the traditional schematic has been you got your very conservative voters, your somewhat conservative voters, a slice of moderates, and you win in the somewhat conservative space.
Somewhat conservative is always the path.
Right. So now
Trump dominates those.
Yeah, but now now he dominates the very conservatives. So there's an opening somewhat. But the schematic's different. You got the strong MAGA, the somewhat MAGA, and the non-MAGA. And a Monmouth poll had 50% MAGA of some variety, 40% non-MAGA. So you probably need both. And DeSantis is still, I think, in theory, the best suited to draw from the somewhat MAGA and the non-MAGA.
Something that has gotten under the radar in Politico today. A congressman, his name's Dean Phillips. He's apparently going to be meeting with some donors here in New York about a potential primary challenge to Joe Biden. He is somebody that has denounced the No Labels effort and thinks the Democratic Party needs to have a robust debate about who should be the nominee.
So does a guy named Kennedy, by the way.
Yeah, well, him, but he's not. He's not a serious guy. Dean Phillips, I think, is a pretty serious guy. How widespread is that feeling, do you think, among Democratic elite, particularly? You know, you hear the chatter.
I would say not very.
Okay.
Many Democrats, I suspect, wish that Joe Biden could be 10 or 15 years younger. But he knows how to defeat Donald Trump. And so I think most Democrats, certainly most Democrats I speak to, are prepared to see.
Do you think he's only running for re-election because Trump's running? Do you think this would be a different conversation if Trump weren't running?
Frankly, yes, I do. But if I could make one last point, look at the last three people who were elected president, where they were in July, the year before the election. Obama was a strong number 2. Trump had just announced, wasn't taken seriously.
Kind of a strong, becoming a strong number 2.
And Biden was in single digits.
Yeah. Very quickly, Mitch McConnell, it feels like the reality, that statement he put out didn't sound like a guy who's going to stay in the Senate for his whole term. It just simply sounded like a guy that says, look, we're not doing leadership elections this Congress.
Yeah, that makes sense. But obviously, that was a really concerning event. And I hope that.
How much has this scrambled those Senate Republican leadership? Do you think a lot?
I think a lot. Yeah.
I do too.
Yeah, it'll be a jump ball.
Jay Johnson, Rich Lowry. It's good to see you guys.
Thank you.
I need to get up here more. We're going to continue to track the ongoing crisis in Niger as the country contends with the attempted coup of its democratically elected president. And we in the United States are officially only calling it an attempted coup still, because of some legal reasons, what it would mean for our troops that are there. Earlier today, the Presidential Guard, which barricaded President Bazoum inside the presidential palace, declared that their leader, General Tiani, was the new head of state and that the country's constitution has been suspended. The group that calls themselves the National Council for Safeguarding the Country claim they will now exercise all legislative and executive power. And so while the leaders of this attempted coup called on international partners to cooperate with the new regime, in a new statement today, the White House National Security Council is calling today's developments an unconstitutional seizure of power. But they are not calling it a coup, because that would trigger U.S. laws that require the State Department and Defense Department to cut off all foreign assistance, limit military partnerships. This afternoon, the NSC again called for President Bazoum's immediate and safe release. NBC News has been live on the ground in Niger's capital since the crisis began, and we will continue to bring you developments as they happen. We'll be right back. Biden is hitting the road again, and this time he's traveling to Maine. It's his first visit to the state as president. Biden visited a textiles plant where he signed an executive order boosting incentives for manufacturing companies to produce new inventions domestically. But the trip comes as Biden continues to tout his Bidenomics message amid a wave of favorable economic news and statistics, from the Federal Reserve easing concerns about a recession, better than expected GDP numbers, and a boost in consumer confidence. This is an attempt to say, hey, give me some credit, is what he's looking for. Joining me now, NBC White House correspondent Ali Rafa. So, Ali, he went to a part of the state that he has not won politically. It was the Maine splits their electoral votes. He went to that second congressional district that has supported Trump 2 elections in a row with a message of bringing jobs back to the U.S., so clearly trying to appeal to that populist wing of Maine's electorate.
Yeah, Chuck, the president clearly trying to chip away at some of that support for the former president in past elections, trying to bank on what he hopes will be a success over a year from now come the 2024 election. And that sort of plays into what we've seen, this pattern from Team Biden, where the president consistently goes to these locations across the country for these Bidenomics Investing in America events, these red districts or red-leaning districts that are led by Republicans Republicans who oppose the legislation that he's touting on the campaign trail. He's taking credit for this booming economy that's been recovering, and that sort of goes into the larger argument that we saw the president present today. He talked about boosting manufacturing and continuing to keep innovation within the United States, cutting red tape, offering incentives to be able to do that. And that plays into the Biden team's long game here. They want to own the economic messaging of the 2024 campaign period, Chuck.
You know, Allie, it strikes me that we couldn't get this in until our last segment of our show today. Why? Because of the coverage of Trump and the indictments. And I'm curious, is the White House frustrated that Trump legal issues consume so much attention that they can't get their message across? Or they'd rather have that than too much coverage of what they're doing?
Definitely the latter. They see this as a benefit. They're making the argument that, as Republicans struggle to sort of navigate the messaging around this myriad of controversies that we're seeing from Republicans, including the legal woes of the former president, they're sticking with this consistent economic messaging. It may be, in some viewers' opinions, boring, but to the Biden team, it's a safe message that they can rely on to be a successful factor in the 2024 election. They're saying that, there's really the proof is in the pudding here. Republicans cannot argue with the cold, hard facts, the cold numbers that the president is touting. And it's, as I said, evidenced in really the regions that the president is going to on the campaign trail to tout these economic numbers.
Allie Rafa covering the Biden White House for us. Allie, thank you. And thank you all for being with us this hour and this week. We'll be back with Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And, of course, if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. Chris Coons, Will Hurd, and the great Chuck Rosenberg. NBC News Now coverage continues with Tom Costello, who's sitting in for Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.